She arrived in Wyoming with a worn leather bag, $40, and a name she'd signed to a contract she barely understood. The town took one look at her and started counting down the days until she'd quit. The ranch was dying. The man she'd agreed to marry was a stranger drowning in debt and silence. Everything around her was broken. The fences, the finances, the future. Most women would have turned around and never looked back. Adeline Mercer was not most women, and what she built from the wreckage of that failing ranch would change an entire territory forever. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. This one's worth it. The stagecoach hit a rut so deep that Adeline's head knocked against the wooden frame hard enough to leave a mark. She pressed two fingers to her temple, winced, and looked out the smudged window at a landscape that offered nothing by way of comfort. Wyoming. She'd tried to prepare herself. She'd read the pamphlet the marriage agency gave her 3 times. Wide open spaces. Opportunity for the right woman. Hardworking man seeking capable partner for frontier life. She'd told herself frontier life meant hard work, and hard work was something she understood better than most. She'd grown up scrubbing other people's floors in Cincinnati, cooking for a household of 7 on a budget meant for 4, learning to make something from nothing because nothing was usually all she had. But she hadn't prepared herself for this. The town of Harlow Creek sat at the base of a long, flat stretch of land that the locals apparently called a valley, though it looked more like the earth had simply given up trying to be interesting. A handful of buildings lined a dirt road that the recent spring rains had turned into a muddy channel. A general store with a broken awning. A saloon that seemed to be doing the only healthy business in sight. A church with a listing steeple. And beyond it all, stretching toward the gray-smudged mountains, an ocean of brown grass and wire fence and silence. The stagecoach groaned to a stop in front of what might have been a hotel or might have been a boarding house. The hand-painted sign was faded past legibility. The driver dropped her trunk in the mud without ceremony. "Cole Ranch?" Adeline asked him, clutching her bag against her side. The man squinted at her with the particular expression of someone doing arithmetic they didn't like. "About 4 miles north," he said. "You the bride?" "I am." He looked her up and down, the kind of look she'd gotten her whole life, the one that started at her hips and worked its way up to her face with an air of mild surprise, as if her face being reasonably pleasant was somehow inconsistent with the rest of her. She'd learned not to flinch at it. She just looked back at him steadily until he glanced away. "There a wagon coming for me?" she asked. "Don't know nothing about that." There wasn't. She waited 40 minutes on the steps of the boarding house with her trunk in the mud and her hat catching the wind, watching the town of Harlow Creek go about its slow, suspicious business. A few women crossed the street to avoid passing too close. An old man sitting outside the saloon watched her with the open curiosity of someone who'd run out of other entertainment. 2 boys on horses stopped at the far end of the road and stared. Eventually, a buckboard wagon came rattling in from the north, pulled by a roan mare that looked about as enthusiastic about the situation as anyone else. The man driving it was not Garrett Cole. He was somewhere in his 50s, weathered to leather, with a mustache that dominated his face and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades arguing with the sun. "Miss Mercer?" he called out. "That's me. I'm Pete Dolan, work the Cole Ranch." He hopped down with surprising agility for his age and grabbed her trunk before she could argue. "Mr. Cole sent his apologies. He's dealing with a fence situation on the south pasture." "A fence situation?" Adeline repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She climbed up onto the buckboard. Pete Dolan snapped the reins and they headed north. He didn't offer much in the way of conversation, and she didn't push. She was too busy looking at what she was driving into. The land opened up as they moved away from town. She could see the logic of it, how someone might have looked at this country 20 or 30 years ago and seen possibility in it. The grass would have been deep then, the soil rich beneath it, the creeks running full in the spring. She could see the bones of what it had been. But the pastures they passed were thin and overgrazed, the creek bed they crossed was barely a trickle, and the fence line she could spot in the distance sagged in ways that spoke of long neglect. "How long have you worked for Mr. Cole?" she asked Pete. "Going on 12 years. "And the ranch? How long has it been struggling?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Pete adjusted his hat and kept his eyes on the road. "Few years," he finally said, "since his wife passed." Adeline filed that away. The ranch house came into view around a long bend, and her first honest thought was, well, it's still standing, which was not nothing. It was a two-story structure that had probably been handsome once, back when someone was maintaining it. The porch ran the full front length, which was a good feature, but two of the posts were visibly rotting at the base, and someone had wedged what appeared to be a feed bucket under one end of the roof overhang to keep it from sagging further. The whitewash had peeled down to raw gray wood in patches. The kitchen garden beside the house was weeds and hard dirt. There was a bunkhouse about 60 yards back, a barn that was missing half its weather vane, two smaller outbuildings she couldn't identify yet, and a corral where half a dozen cattle stood in the kind of listless, dull-eyed way that cattle only stood when they weren't getting enough to eat. Pete pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down. "I'll get your trunk," he said. "In a minute." Adeline stayed where she was, sitting up on the buckboard, and made herself really look at everything. Not the way she'd looked from the road, not the first impression, not the polite assessment, but the real look. The one where you stop hoping it's better than it seems and just let it be exactly as bad as it is, so you can start figuring out what to do about it. The cattle were thin, but they were there. The barn was damaged, but it had its walls. The fields beyond the corral were dry, but they weren't dead. The house was falling apart, but it was standing. "Okay," she said quietly, to no one in particular. She climbed down. Tumdan. The inside of the house was better than the outside in the way that a minor catastrophe is better than a major one. Someone had made an attempt at tidying. There was a broom that had clearly been used recently, and the table in the front room was clear. But the curtains were gray with dust. The floor had warps in it that suggested water damage from a leak somewhere above. And the smell of the place was the particular smell of a house where someone lives alone and doesn't cook anything but the minimum necessary to keep going. Pete set her trunk in the front room and stood awkwardly by the door. "Mr. Cole will be in before dark," he said. "I can get the kitchen fire going if you—" "I'll do it," Adeline said. "Is there food in the house?" "There's beans, some salt pork, flour that might still be good." "Coffee?" "Some." "All right, thank you, Mr. Dolan." He looked slightly relieved to be dismissed, nodded once, and left. Adeline stood in the front room of her new husband's house for a moment. Then she unpinned her hat, set it on the table, rolled up her sleeves, and went to find the kitchen. It was worse than she expected. The cook stove was good. That was something. It was a big iron range, old but solid, the kind of thing built to last a generation. But the chimney clearly hadn't been cleaned in months. There were mouse droppings along the back wall, the water barrel was less than a quarter full, and the pantry shelves held one sack of beans that was getting low, a chunk of salt pork wrapped in cloth, half a sack of flour, a tin of coffee with about a week's worth left in it, a jar of lard, and 3 withered potatoes she found at the back of a shelf that she almost missed. She stood in front of that pantry for a full minute. Then she tied on an apron she found hanging behind the pantry door. It was a man's apron, too big for her, but she knotted it around twice, and she got to work. By the time the light outside turned orange, she had a pot of beans on the stove with the salt pork and every seasoning she could find, which was salt, pepper, and a tin of dried sage that someone had optimistically purchased and never used. She'd made cornbread from the flour, figuring there had to be cornmeal somewhere, and there was, in a crock she found under the work table. She'd also heated water for washing up and had beaten the worst of the dust from the front room curtains and left them hanging in the evening air. It wasn't much, but it was more than there'd been an hour ago, and Adeline had learned to count those things. She was scrubbing out the water barrel when she heard boots on the porch. But Garrett Cole was not what she'd pictured. The photograph the agency had sent was years old, she realized immediately. It showed a younger, softer-faced version of the man who now stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, looking at her with an expression that was impossible to read. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than the photograph suggested, with the kind of weathered outdoor face that aged in ways a camera couldn't track. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes that were, she noticed this despite herself, a particular shade of dark gray that caught the lamplight in an unexpected way. He was also covered in dust and dried mud from what appeared to have been an extremely unpleasant encounter with the south pasture fence situation. They looked at each other for a moment that stretched slightly past comfortable. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. "Mr. Cole." She straightened up from the barrel. "I apologize for being in your kitchen without asking. There wasn't anyone to ask, and the situation seemed to call for—" "No, He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "I should have been there to meet you. The stage." Pete Dolan was very kind. Another silence. He was looking at the stove, at the pot on it, at the cornbread on the work table. Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it exactly, but it was something like someone who hasn't eaten a real meal in a long time, suddenly remembering what one smells like. "That's beans?" he asked. "With salt pork and sage. It'll be about another 20 minutes. There's water on for washing up if you want to." She gestured vaguely toward the basin she'd set on the side table. He washed his hands and face in silence. She went back to scrubbing the water barrel. When he dried his hands and turned around, some of the guardedness had gone out of his posture, or at least shifted into something less like defense and more like confusion. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. He wasn't saying it dismissively. He sounded more like a man who'd forgotten that someone doing something helpful was even a possibility. "I was hungry," she said, "and the kitchen was in a state." "Yeah." He looked around at it with an expression that wasn't quite shame, but was in that neighborhood. I haven't had much time." "The ranch keeps you busy." "Lately." He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down heavily, like a man whose legs had been waiting all day for permission. "I know this isn't what you probably expected. The agency, I sent them a description of the situation here, but I don't know how much they told me it was a working cattle ranch in Wyoming looking for a capable woman interested in frontier life," Adeline said pleasantly. "They were technically accurate on all counts." He looked at her for a moment. "That's generous of you." "It's honest of me. I don't really do generous when there's no call for it." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but in the vicinity of one. "That's so. Mr. Cole, I want to be straightforward with you, since we're going to be living under the same roof, and that tends to work better with honesty than without it." She set down the scrub brush and turned to face him properly. "I came here through an agency because I'm 25 years old. I have no family left to speak of, and I needed a situation where my ability to work hard counted for more than what I brought to it in the way of money or connections. I know how to cook, how to manage a household, how to keep accounts, and how to make something decent from not very much. I'm not delicate, I'm not easily frightened, and I don't quit things." She paused. "I can also see that this ranch is in serious trouble. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I'd like to know the actual shape of that trouble, if you're willing to tell me, because I can't help with what I don't know about." Garrett Cole sat at his kitchen table and looked at his new wife for a long moment. "It's worse than it looks," he said finally. "I was afraid of that." She turned back to the stove to check the beans. "Tell me over supper." Ouch. The shape of it told over beans and cornbread with 2 oil lamps burning between them because the light was fading fast, was this. The ranch had been in debt for 3 years. Garrett's father had built it, and Garrett had inherited both the land and the loans against it when his father died. He'd married young, a woman named Clara, who'd grown up in Cheyenne and come to the frontier with more optimism than equipment for the life. They'd had 2 good years. Then the cattle market dropped. Then the winter of '84 hit harder than any winter in a decade. Then Clara got sick in the spring and was gone before summer. After that, Garrett said all of this in the flat, factual voice of someone who had told himself the story enough times that he'd taken all the feeling out of it, like wringing water from a cloth until it came out dry. After that, he'd been keeping the ranch alive by will and stubbornness, and not much else. He owed the Harlow Creek Bank $1,100. He had 6 men working for him, none of them paid in full since February. He had 43 head of cattle, most of them underweight. He had a hay supplier who was threatening to cut him off if the account wasn't settled by end of June. And he had a ranch house falling off its foundations. Adeline listened to all of it without interrupting. She ate her beans. She refilled his bowl without being asked because she could see he was hungrier than he was letting on. When he finished, she said, "What's your income right now?" He looked slightly surprised that this was the question she led with. "Sold 8 head in March. Made $60. "And your monthly expenses?" "Before wages, supplies, feed, loan service, around $90. So you're running a $30 deficit every month before you pay your men." More or less, Adeline set her spoon down. And the cattle you have, what condition are they in, really? Could they go to market now if you needed them to? Not at a price worth taking. How long until they'd be ready? End of summer, if the grass comes in right and we can get the feed situation sorted. And the land itself, is it good land under all of this? Garrett looked at her with an expression that suggested the question surprised him, like no one had asked him that in a long time. He looked out the window at the darkness beyond where his land was, even if he couldn't see it. Yeah, he said, it's good land. My father knew that much. Then it's salvageable. Maybe. No, she said. I don't work in maybes. Is the land good enough to run a proper operation if you had the capital to do it right? A beat. Yes. All right. She stood up and started clearing the bowls. We'll figure it out. Just like that? She looked at him. What would you prefer? That I wring my hands for a while first? He didn't answer that. But he watched her carry the bowls to the basin, and she thought she heard something that might have been a short, quiet sound that was maybe, distantly, almost a laugh. The workers' supper situation, she discovered the next morning, was exactly as dire as everything else. There were 6 ranch hands total. Pete Dolan was the senior man. The others were a young man named Will Cutler, 20 at most, who looked like he hadn't had a full meal in weeks. Brothers called Joe and Dennis Hatch, who didn't speak much but worked constantly. A quiet, careful man named Samuel, who she'd later learn had come north from Texas and sent half of everything he earned back to his mother. And a large, perpetually cheerful man named Otto, who had some German in his accent and had somehow maintained high spirits through circumstances that would have flattened most people. They ate beans. Cold beans, it turned out, because the arrangement had been that whoever got to the bunkhouse kitchen first in the morning made the fire, and whatever was there was what there was. There was no regular cook. There was no regular meal. There was a pot of beans that got reheated and supplemented when someone remembered. Adeline stood in the bunkhouse doorway the morning after she arrived and watched Will Cutler eating cold beans from a tin with the mechanical attention of someone fueling a machine rather than feeding a person. And something in her chest did a thing she recognized, a kind of quiet, practical fury that always made her work harder. When was the last time anyone had a hot breakfast? She asked. Will looked up. Ma'am? In this bunkhouse. When was the last hot breakfast? He thought about it with genuine effort. Maybe February? It was May. Right, she said. Give me an hour. She couldn't fix everything. She knew that. She had $40 of her own money, which she was not going to volunteer immediately, and the ranch's available cash was somewhere below $20 and needed to stretch until Garrett could figure out the next cattle sale. She couldn't make a feast from air, but she had flour and lard, and she'd found a crock of honey at the back of the pantry shelf, and she could make biscuits in her sleep, and she had the beans from last night and the salt pork, and she knew how to fry things in a way that made them taste like a choice rather than a last resort. 6 men sat down to hot biscuits and fried salt pork and beans with black pepper and hot coffee at a properly set table. She'd found a tablecloth, gray with washing but serviceable, and the quiet that fell over that table was the quiet of people who were trying not to show how much it meant to them. Otto was the one who couldn't help himself. He looked at his plate and then up at Adeline and said with complete sincerity, "This is the best thing I have eaten in this country in 6 months." "It's biscuits and beans," Adeline said. "Yes," said Otto, "and it is wonderful." Pete Dolan cleared his throat. "Will's been pushing himself past what's safe. Most of us have. We don't eat right. We can't work right." "I know that," she said. "I'm going to fix the kitchen first." She caught Garrett looking at her from the doorway. He'd come in quietly, partway through. She hadn't heard him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully decode, but she thought it might have been something like a man who'd been holding his breath a long time, just starting to remember how to exhale. The town of Harlow Creek made its opinion of her known within 48 hours of her arrival. She'd walked into the general store for supplies. She'd made a list, calculated what the ranch's current cash could cover, prioritized, and had felt the shift in the room when she walked through the door. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody was rude, exactly. But there were looks exchanged over her head, the special kind of small-town exchange that communicated volumes in a glance. The woman at the counter was named Mrs. Fitch. She was perhaps 50, neatly dressed, with the particular manner of someone who considered herself the custodian of community standards. "You're the new Mrs. Cole," she said. Not as a question. "I am. Adeline Cole." She'd decided, practically, to use the name. It was on the marriage certificate. "Where are you from, dear?" "Cincinnati, most recently." Mrs. Fitch looked her over in the same way the stagecoach driver had, though she was more practiced at concealing it. "And you came out through one of those agencies?" "I did." "Well," a small pause that carried a great deal of subtext. "We'll see how you find Wyoming." Later, outside, she overheard two women talking on the steps of the dry goods store. She wasn't supposed to hear. They had their backs mostly turned. But sound carried funny in towns like this. Can't imagine what Garrett was thinking. "Well, she'll be gone by July, mark my words. Those ranch hands are already talking about looking for other work." Poor man, as if he didn't have enough trouble. Adeline walked past them and kept walking. She had learned, a long time ago, that the most effective response to people who expected you to fail was to outlast their interest in watching. Let them predict your departure. Let them calculate your odds. Just don't be there when they were right. She had no intention of being there when they were right. The first week was an education in exactly how bad things were. She spent 3 mornings going through the account books Garrett had in a wooden box under the kitchen work table because he hadn't shown them to her and she'd found them while cleaning and asked if she could look. He'd said yes, with the air of a man who was half relieved and half dreading what she'd find, because he knew what was in there. What was in there was 11 months of steadily declining income, set against expenses that had been cut and cut and cut until there was almost nothing left to cut. She could see, in the numbers, the shape of a man trying to manage an impossible situation through sheer stubbornness. The wages owed to the men were recorded meticulously, each shortfall noted in Garrett's careful handwriting, as if keeping track of the debt made it more manageable somehow. He'd been paying them what he could and keeping careful record of the rest. She found that surprisingly. The meticulous records. It told her something about who Garrett Cole was that the state of the house hadn't. She was cross-referencing the hay supplier accounts against the cattle records one evening. Garrett was out with Pete dealing with a section of fence that had come down when she noticed something. The ranch had been selling cattle to a buyer named Harlan Pruitt in Cheyenne, and the price per head was, she was fairly certain, about 15% below what she'd read the market was bearing. She read the records twice to make sure she was reading them right. Then she went and found the old copy of the Wyoming Territorial Gazette that she'd seen in the front room and found the livestock market report and did the math again. She was right. For 2 years, the ranch had been consistently underselling to Pruitt, and the difference, compounded over that time, was not a small number. She sat with that information for the rest of the evening. When Garrett came in, dust-covered and tired, she waited until he'd washed up and poured himself the last of the coffee. "The Pruitt sales," she said. He went still. "What about them?" "You've been selling below market, consistently, by about 15 cents a head." A long silence. "Pruitt's reliable. Other buyers want you to come to them with volume and the right timing. Pruitt takes what you've got when you've got it, and charges you for the convenience. It's not—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "I know the number's not ideal, but when you're trying to keep a roof on, I'm not criticizing you," she said. She meant it. "I'm just telling you what I see. We find another buyer, we pick up those 15 cents. That's real money over time." He looked at her. "You read ledgers." "I can read most things." Another long silence. Then, "Clara couldn't stand accounts. She said numbers made her headache." Adeline wasn't sure if that was a comparison meant to be flattering or just an observation. She let it sit. "I'll keep looking at the books, if you don't mind." "I don't mind." He picked up his coffee, then quietly, "The fence today? We lost another section. That's 3 this spring. What does new fencing cost?" He told her. She wrote it in her notebook. That was how they started working together, not romantically, not smoothly, not even comfortably exactly. Just 2 people sitting across a kitchen table after long days, talking about fence costs and hay prices, and what the cattle might weigh by August, building something functional from the rubble of a situation that had no business being salvageable. It wasn't graceful, but it was real. The kitchen, she had decided within the first week, was going to be her engine, not just because she was good in a kitchen, which she was, but because the kitchen was the one room in the house with something solid to work with. That iron range was a real asset, big enough to run 6 burners at once. She'd cleaned the chimney herself on the 4th day, climbing up with a brush she'd made Pete Dolan help her improvise, and the draw was good now, even and strong. The oven held temperature properly. She'd also, on that same 4th day, found that the kitchen garden wasn't as dead as it looked. The soil underneath the weeds was still dark and workable. She spent an afternoon pulling weeds, her back aching, her hands filthy, and found garlic that had been left to go wild, plus onions and some herbs she couldn't immediately identify, but thought might be thyme. Will Cutler, walking past, slowed down and then stopped. "Can I help with that?" he asked. She looked up at him. He was a young man with a sunburned face and earnest eyes, and the particular hunger of someone who wanted to be useful and hadn't been given enough chances. "Grab a weed," she said. He worked beside her for 2 hours. By the end, they'd cleared half the garden, and Will had told her, in the slightly disjointed way of young men talking to women they're not sure how to talk to, that he'd grown up on a farm in Kansas, that his mother had died when he was 14, that he'd come to Wyoming because it seemed like the kind of place where a person could make something of themselves from scratch. Adeline recognized that impulse. "Do you know anything about vegetable gardening?" she asked. "A bit. My mother kept a big kitchen garden." "Good. Help me plan what to plant. We're behind the season, but not impossible." He looked at her like she'd offered him something valuable. "Yes, ma'am." "And stop calling me ma'am. Adeline is fine." He looked uncertain about that for a second. Then he nodded. "Adeline." At the end of the first week, Adeline sat on the sagging front porch in the cool of the evening, her feet aching, her hands raw from the week's work, and looked at the dark shapes of the land in front of her. She thought about Cincinnati, the rooming house where she'd spent 3 years after leaving the Whitmore household, where she'd worked as a cook's assistant until she'd understood the kitchen well enough to run it herself, where she'd saved money in a tin box she kept under the floorboard, where she'd answered the agency advertisement on a Sunday in March and spent 3 weeks in an agony of indecision before signing her name. She hadn't told anyone she was leaving. There wasn't anyone who would have needed to know. She looked at the ranch house around her, the bucket holding up the porch roof, the missing shingles she'd spotted from the yard, the way the left side of the porch sagged almost imperceptibly, but measurably if you knew how to look. She reached into her apron pocket and found her notebook. She made a list. Fencing, porch supports, kitchen garden, cattle weight gain timeline, alternative feed sources, hay supplier negotiation, Pruitt situation, wages owed to men. Then, at the bottom, she wrote, "Find more income." She stared at that line for a while in the dark. She didn't have an answer yet, but she had the question, which was always the place to start. Oh, the day she discovered the railroad camp, she hadn't been looking for it. She'd borrowed a horse, a Placid Bay mare named Nell, who Pete Dolan confirmed was reliable for someone who, as Adeline had admitted frankly, hadn't ridden much, and gone east from the ranch, following a creek she'd seen on an old survey map she found rolled up in the box with the ledgers. She wanted to understand the land's water situation, because water was going to matter when summer came. She'd been riding for about an hour when she came over a low rise and saw it spread below her. A tent city, maybe half a mile in length, running alongside a freshly graded rail bed, dozens of tents, cook fires, equipment, and men. She could see them from here, hundreds of them, the tiny figures of a labor force. She sat on Nell for a long moment, looking. Then she counted the cook fires and estimated the tents and thought about what it took to feed that many men every day, out here, in the middle of Wyoming, where the nearest town with a proper supply of anything was Harlow Creek, which was, she calculated, about 4 miles west. She thought about the iron range sitting in the ranch kitchen. She thought about the garden she was replanting. She thought about the $40 in her bag and the $1,100 in debt and the $30 monthly deficit. And she thought, someone is feeding these men. The question is who and whether they're doing it well. She turned Nell around and rode back to the ranch with something that felt, for the first time since she'd arrived in Wyoming, like a direction. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow bedroom that was now technically hers. She and Garrett had worked around the question of sleeping arrangements with the practical awkwardness of two adults in an impossible situation, arriving at a solution that involved him taking the bedroom he'd shared with Clara and her taking the smaller room at the end of the hall, a solution that neither of them had spoken aloud but had somehow mutually agreed upon. And she stared at the ceiling and worked. Not with paper, not yet. In her head, the way she'd always done her best thinking. She was a person whose mind ran best in the dark and the quiet, when there was nothing to interrupt the arithmetic. How many men in that camp? Hard to estimate from a ridge, but at least 300. Could be closer to 5. A railroad operation that size, grading, laying ties, running rail, needed men on the job by first light, which meant they needed to be fed by the time the light came. They needed feeding at midday. They needed feeding again in the evening. 3 meals a day, 300 men minimum. That was 900 meals a day, at minimum. Who was feeding them currently? There'd be a camp cook or cooks. There always was on a railroad job. But a crew this size, this far from a supply town, was almost certainly eating poorly. She knew the economics of large-scale camp cooking because she'd read about it and because the logic of it was simple. You had a budget per man per day. You were trying to feed them something hot and sufficient, and you were doing it under difficult conditions. The result, almost always, was monotonous, mediocre, barely adequate. She knew the value of not monotonous and not mediocre. She knew what it felt like to eat something real after a long time of eating something barely sufficient. She'd seen it on 6 men's faces at a bunkhouse table a week ago. She'd seen it in Will Cutler's posture changing as he finished those biscuits. There was something here. She could feel it the way she'd learned to feel the shape of an idea when it was solid, a kind of weight to it, a density that told her it could hold up if you leaned on it. The question was how to get from where she was to where the idea needed to be. She was still working on that when she fell asleep sometime past midnight with the notebook open on the bed beside her. She told Garrett about the railroad camp the next morning over coffee. She hadn't decided how to raise it. She just raised it because that was generally what she did. She said the thing, and then they figured out what to do about it. She'd found with Garrett, in the first week and a half of their peculiar arrangement, that he responded better to directness than to framing. He didn't need to be managed. He needed to be talked to straight. "There's a railroad camp about 6 miles east," she said. He looked up from his coffee. "The Northern Pacific Spur Line. I know it. There are at least 300 men there, maybe more. Something like that. And they're being fed by their camp operation." "I'd assume so." He watched her carefully. He'd started watching her that way, like someone who'd learned that when she brought up an apparently random topic at the breakfast table, there was usually a point coming. "I want to go talk to whoever runs the camp kitchen," she said. "I want to know what they're doing and what they're not doing and whether there's room for something else." A pause. "What kind of something else?" "I cook," she said. "I cook well. The men we have here can tell you that, and I've been cooking for 6 people for under a week. If I could cook for 300... Adeline." He said her name in a way that wasn't dismissal, exactly, but was somewhere in that direction. That's not just cooking. That's an operation. That's supplies and transport, and I know what it is," she said. "I'm not saying I have it all figured out. I'm saying I want to find out if there's something to figure out. Will you come with me to the camp?" He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running through the reasons not to. The ranch needed him. The fence needed him. The cattle needed him. Time was money they didn't have. She could see all of that crossing his face. Then he set down his coffee cup. "I'll hitch the wagon," he said. The camp foreman's name was Bill Haskell, and he had the particular energy of a man who had too many problems and no patience for new ones. He met them at the edge of the camp with crossed arms and a skeptical expression that did not improve when he registered that one of the people who'd come to see him was a woman. "You run the kitchen operation here?" Adeline asked. "We got a cook, 3 cooks." He corrected himself. "What's this about?" "I'd like to know if your men are satisfied with the food." A short silence. "Satisfied." He said the word like he was testing it for structural integrity. "They're fed. That's what they're getting paid for." "Are they performing well? Are they maintaining pace on the grade? His eyes narrowed. Who are you? Adeline Cole. My husband and I run the Cole Ranch, about 6 miles west. Adeline smiled pleasantly. I'm not here to waste your time, Mr. Haskell. I've been feeding 6 ranch hands for 2 weeks, and I can tell you from direct experience that a man who eats well works harder and gets hurt less. I'd like to make the case that I can feed your men better than they're currently being fed, with a significant improvement in their energy and productivity. He stared at her. You're offering to what exactly? Cook for 300 railroad workers? I'm offering to find out if it makes sense for both of us. She kept her smile even and her voice level. Can I talk to your cook, or one of them? Bill Haskell looked past her at Garrett, as if checking whether Garrett was going to do something that made this situation make more sense. Garrett, to his credit, just looked back at him calmly. 5 minutes, Haskell said. What? 5 minutes with the camp cook turned into 20. His name was Archie, and he was a tired, overwhelmed man who'd been attempting to cook for 240 men with equipment designed for half that, and supply deliveries that were consistently late and often wrong. He told her all of this with the relief of a person who'd been waiting for someone to ask. What do you have most consistently? She asked. What can you count on coming in? Flour, dried beans, salt pork, coffee. He listed these like a man reading from a headstone. Sometimes potatoes. Rarely anything that ain't preserved. And what are the men complaining about? He snorted. What aren't they? Most often. Same food every day, no variety. Bread's bad. I'm not a baker. The oven we got isn't right for bread. No hot meal at midday. Adeline turned that last part over. No hot midday meal? They get biscuits and cold whatever's left from morning. It's not enough. He said this quietly. They're doing hard labor. It's not enough. I know it's not enough. But I can't be in 2 places at once, and the equipment... Could you get a hot midday meal to them at the worksite? If someone brought it to them, sure, but there's no one... What if someone brought it? He looked at her. What are you saying? Adeline said, I'm saying, let me try. Dent. Bill Haskell said no the first time. That was fine. She'd expected that. He said no in the way of a man who was skeptical but not entirely closed, which she'd also expected, because she'd watched his face while she was talking to Archie, and she'd seen the moment when he'd done the arithmetic on whether his crew's productivity could improve and decided the number was probably interesting. She came back 2 days later with a proposition written out in her clearest handwriting, along with a sample. The sample was a pot of beef stew. She'd used a small amount of the ranch's emergency money, the last of it, to buy 1 pound of beef from the butcher in Harlow Creek, and she'd made it stretch further than 1 pound of beef had any right to stretch, with potatoes and onions from the garden in progress, and the wild garlic and a good stock she'd made from bones she'd saved, and cornbread and coffee kept hot in a wrapped pot. She set it on Bill Haskell's camp table without ceremony and said, "Try it." He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked up a spoon. The silence that followed was the kind she'd learned to read. "What's your number?" he asked when he'd finished half the bowl. She told him. He looked pained. "That's high." "It's worth it. You know it's worth it." A long pause. He tapped his spoon against the bowl. "You can deliver midday 6 days a week?" "Yes." "For how many men?" "Start with 150. I'll tell you when I can scale." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man making a decision he wasn't certain about. "I want to see it work for a week before I commit to anything." "That's fair," she said. She rode back to the ranch with the empty stew pot rattling behind her in the wagon and a feeling in her chest that she hadn't had in a long time. Not certainty. She'd learned not to mistake a beginning for a conclusion, but possibility. Real, weighted, solid possibility. She drove the wagon back through the gates of the coal ranch and looked at the broken porch and the thin cattle and the fields that were just beginning, just barely beginning, to show the first green tips of spring growth. "Okay," she said quietly, to all of it. "Here we go." The first delivery almost didn't happen. She'd spent 3 days planning it down to the last detail, or what she thought was the last detail. And then the morning of the first run, she woke up at 4 o'clock to discover that Nell, the bay mare she'd been relying on for transport, had thrown a shoe sometime in the night and was walking tender on her left forefoot. Pete Dolan delivered this news in the gray pre-dawn with the expression of a man who felt genuinely bad about it, which didn't change the fact that she had 4 hours to get a hot meal to 150 railroad workers 6 miles east and no reliable way to get it there. She stood in the barn for a moment looking at Nell's hoof, then at the barn around her, then at the pre-dawn sky through the open barn door. Then she went and knocked on Garrett's bedroom door. He opened it faster than she expected, which meant he'd probably already been awake. He was dressed, mostly, though his shirt was only half-buttoned, and he had the look of a man whose sleep had been as approximate as hers. "Nell threw a shoe," she said. "I need the wagon and a horse that isn't lame." He looked at her for 1 second. "Give me 5 minutes." He gave her 4. They hitched the ranch's other working horse, a stocky gray gelding named Dutch, who had a personality like a stubborn piece of furniture, to the supply wagon, and Adeline spent those same 4 minutes running calculations in her head about whether Dutch's pace was going to make or break her timeline. It was going to be close. "I can drive," Garrett said. "I need you here. Pete said the south fence. Pete can handle the south fence for one morning." He climbed up onto the wagon seat with a tone that didn't particularly invite argument. "You cook. I'll drive." She didn't argue. She climbed up beside him, and they headed out into the dark before the sun had properly committed to rising. They made it in time. Barely. Dutch turned out to have strong opinions about his pace, but, pressed, maintained a trot that got them to the camp perimeter as the work crews were assembling for the day. Adeline was out of the wagon before it fully stopped, lifting the lid on the first pot to check temperature. The stew had stayed hot, the cornbread was still warm, the coffee was where it needed to be. And then she was serving, ladling stew into the tin cups and plates that Archie had agreed to supply, moving fast and steady down the line of men who'd come to see what this was about. The first man in line, big, dark-bearded, suspicious-faced, looked into his cup and then looked at her. "This real stew? Beef and potato. Take the cornbread, too." He took it, moved on. The next man, and the next. The line moved faster than she'd anticipated, which was both good and a problem because she was keeping a mental count, and she needed the portions to reach the end of the line. She made them reach. The last man got the bottom of the pot, which was actually the best part. All the richness had settled, and a slightly smaller piece of cornbread than the first man, but she made up for it by giving him the last of the coffee from the pot without being asked. And he tipped his hat at her in a way that she clocked as a good sign. Garrett, who had stayed with the wagon, was watching all of this with an expression she was starting to recognize as his version of impressed. It was a contained expression, not outwardly dramatic, but she'd started to learn his face in the way you learned a landscape you moved through every day, finding the landmarks. On the way back, he said, "How much did that cost to make?" She told him, "And Haskell's paying what I asked." He did the arithmetic. She watched him do it. He was quiet for a moment, watching Dutch's gray haunches moving ahead of them against the morning light. "That's a real margin," he said. "I know. If you scale it, I know, Garrett." He glanced at her. She was looking at the road, but she caught the look in her peripheral vision. "You already ran those numbers." "Several nights ago." Another silence. Dutch snorted at something in the grass beside the road. The morning was coming up pale and clear, the kind of Wyoming morning that made you understand why someone might have decided to stake a life out here. "What do you need?" Garrett asked. Not "this is risky" or "are you sure" or any of the other reasonable questions he could have asked. Just, "What do you need?" Something in Adeline's chest shifted slightly. She kept her eyes on the road. "A reliable horse. Better pots. The ones we have are going to be a problem at scale. And I need Will in the mornings to help with prep. He's not that useful with the cattle yet, and he can cook. A bit. Done. And I'm going to need a supply line into Harlow Creek that doesn't depend on me driving in every other day. Someone needs to go once a week with a list. I'll talk to Pete." She wrote a list in the notebook she kept in her apron pocket. The road bumped under them. Somewhere behind them, the railroad camp was eating her food for the first time, and she would not know until she went back whether it had landed the way she needed it to land. She had run the numbers, and she believed in the food, and she knew what she was doing in a kitchen. But belief wasn't the same as proof, and she had learned not to celebrate before the proof was in. "You're not going to sleep until you know if they liked it," Garrett said. It wasn't a question. "Probably not." "Me neither," he said, which surprised her enough that she looked at him. He was watching the road. His jaw had a week's worth of beard on it, and his hat was pulled down against the morning glare, and he looked, in that moment, like a man who had started paying attention to something again after a long time of not paying attention to anything at all. She looked back at the road. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. That was, she would think later, the morning things began to change between them. Not dramatically, not with words, just a shift in the quality of the silence they kept together. The proof came back that afternoon through Bill Haskell himself, who rode up to the ranch house on a horse considerably better than anything the Cole Ranch currently stabled, and said, without preamble, "My men are asking when the next delivery is." Adeline was in the kitchen garden planting onion sets with Will, and she looked up with dirt on both hands. "Thursday," she said. "They'd like it daily." "I'm not set up for daily yet." Haskell considered that. He was, she had decided, a man who was difficult because his job required it, not because he was built that way. Under the crossed arms and the suspicion was someone who was actually trying to do right by his operation. She could work with that. "What do you need to go daily?" 2 weeks and the right equipment." He named a number, per day, per man, for daily hot meal delivery. It was slightly below what she'd have asked for, which told her she could negotiate it up at least a little. "And a midday delivery," she said. He blinked. "You said—" "I said I'd start with 1. I'm ready to discuss 2. A silence. Then, "My men would work an extra hour a day for a decent midday meal. That's not a guess. I've seen it on other lines. Then your productivity number goes up and my price increase is worth it to you." He studied her for a moment. "You're not what I expected," he said, which was the kind of thing men said when they meant, "You're better at this than I thought a woman would be," but had the self-awareness not to say it that directly. "Nobody ever is," she said pleasantly. "I'll have a written proposal to you by Friday." He rode away. Will watched him go, then turned to look at Adeline with an expression of uncomplicated admiration. "He came all the way out here just to ask for more food," he said. "He came out here to see if he could get it cheaper in person," she said. "He can't. Plant those sets straight. They'll grow crooked otherwise." Will planted the sets straight. That night, after supper, she sat at the kitchen table with Garrett and the ledger books and worked out what daily delivery actually required. The numbers looked possible. Not comfortable. Not yet. But possible, with the right management of supplies and timing. She needed to expand the cooking operation, which meant she needed more equipment, which required investment she didn't yet have but could project forward based on the Haskell income. She was deep in the margin calculations when Garrett, who had been reviewing the cattle records across the table from her, said without looking up, "You know the men talk about your cooking the way they used to talk about water during the dry summer." She looked up. "Which men?" "My men. Dolan told me Will said it's the first time he hasn't felt hungry since February." He paused. "That's not a small thing." Adeline looked at him for a moment. No," she said. "It isn't." He went back to his records. She went back to hers. But something about the exchange stayed with her. The directness of it, the lack of ceremony. Garrett didn't perform appreciation. When he said something, it had been evaluated first. She was learning to trust the weight of it. The operation scaled faster than she'd planned and slower than she needed, which was the condition of most real things. By the 3rd week, she was running 2 deliveries a day to the Haskell camp, 6 days a week, with Will handling morning prep from 4 o'clock onward, and Pete's nephew, a 17-year-old named Charlie who'd shown up looking for seasonal work, running the delivery wagon while Adeline managed the kitchen and the numbers simultaneously. It was not clean, it was not smooth. There were mornings when the fire drew badly and she was behind schedule before sunrise. There was the Friday when Charlie went into a rut in the road and lost a full pot of beans off the back of the wagon, and she had to make the delivery 30 minutes late with a pot and a half instead of 2, rationing on the fly while 50 men waited with varying degrees of patience. There was the ongoing problem of the flour supplier in Harlow Creek, a man named Garrett Whitmore, no relation, who had apparently decided that anyone running a food operation was a commercial customer now and had attempted to double his price without notice. She'd walked into his store on a Tuesday and stood at his counter and looked at the new price written on the small chalkboard behind him. "That's not the price I was quoted," she said. "Prices change," said Whitmore, who was the kind of small businessman whose confidence lived entirely in the architecture of his store, behind his counter, in his territory. They do, she agreed. I have a letter from you dated 3 weeks ago with the previous price. Would you like me to read it to you, or would you like to revise the board? He revised the board. She went home and wrote down the interaction in her notebook under a heading she labeled Negotiations, which was growing into one of the longer sections. Garrett heard about it from Pete, who had driven her to town that day and witnessed the exchange. He brought it up that evening with the slightly careful manner of someone who was impressed by something and wasn't sure if saying so was appropriate. Whitmore's not easy to push back on, he said. He's got the only dry goods in town. He's got competition from Cheyenne if I order by rail, she said. He knows that. He was testing to see if I knew it. Do you? Order from Cheyenne? Not yet, but I will if he tries it again. A pause. He probably won't. No, she agreed. Probably not. Garrett was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then, Clara would have just paid it, he said. Not cruelly. Just as an observation, the way he sometimes made observations about Clara, dropping them into conversations with the brevity of someone who'd been holding them a long time and just occasionally needed to put one down somewhere. She didn't like confrontation. I don't like it either, Adeline said. I just don't let that stop me. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that she couldn't fully name. Not quite recognition, but something in that neighborhood, like a man who'd been looking at a landscape for years and had just noticed a feature he'd somehow missed. No, he said, I'm starting to see that. The money, when it started coming in consistently, felt almost unreal. Not large, not yet, but steady. And steady was what the ranch had not had in years. The first full payment from Haskell was $47 for 2 weeks of deliveries. Adeline put 32 of it directly toward the wages owed to Pete and the men. The look on Pete Dolan's face when she handed him the cash, not his portion, all of it, for all 6 men, the back wages in full, was a look she would keep in her memory for a long time. This is real? He said, looking at the bills. It's real. He folded the money carefully, put it in his shirt pocket, and buttoned the pocket. Then he looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. It was layered, complicated. A man who'd been loyal to something failing for a long time, suddenly seeing it turn. The boys are going to work harder, he said. Not because they have to, because... He stopped. Just because. I know, she said. That's what I was counting on. The cattle, under better care, because men who were paid and fed worked better, which she had calculated for specifically, began to put on weight as the spring grass came in. Garrett could see it, and she could see him seeing it, walking the pastures in the evening sometimes with his hands in his pockets, looking at his herd with an expression that was still cautious but was carrying, underneath the caution, something that was starting to resemble hope. They talked more. That was the change she noticed first. Not grand conversations, nothing dramatic, just the incremental growth of the amount they said to each other in the spaces between work, at supper, walking back from the barn, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening with the accounts. He told her about the ranch when it was good, when his father was alive. The way the pastures had looked in a good year, knee-high with grass you could lose a young calf in. The cattle his father had been proud of. The sense, growing up here, that the land would hold. She told him about Cincinnati. Not all of it, but pieces. The Whitmore household where she'd worked from 16, the cook there, who'd been the first person to tell her she had an instinct for it. The 3 years in the rooming house after. The particular feeling of signing the agency contract, standing in a post office on a gray March morning, and thinking this is either the smartest thing you've ever done or the most desperate. Which was it? He asked. She thought about it. Both, I think. Most things are. He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen smelled like whatever she'd made for supper. The lamp was burning low between them, and neither of them had gotten up to trim it. I almost didn't write to the agency, he said. What stopped you? Nothing. I mean, I almost didn't, and then I did. Pete told me I needed to, not in those words. He said, Garrett, you can't run this place alone and you know it. And then he walked away and didn't say anything else about it for 2 weeks. He let it sit. Smart man. He's smarter than he lets on. A pause. I felt like... I felt like putting an advertisement out for a wife was admitting something. What? He turned his coffee cup in his hands. That I couldn't make it work on my own. That I needed help. You did need help. I know that. Needing help isn't a defeat. I know that too. He said it without defensiveness, just stating a thing he'd apparently arrived at the understanding of recently. I know it now anyway. Adeline looked at him across the kitchen table. He was a complicated man. She'd known that from the first week, when she'd had to parse the difference between his silences that meant anger, and his silences that meant grief, and his silences that meant he was just thinking. He was also, she was increasingly certain, a good one. Not in a simple way. Not in a way that was easy to see from the outside or quick to reveal itself, but the meticulous wage record she'd found in that wooden box. The way Pete Dolan talked about him, which was the way people talked about someone they'd chosen to be loyal to rather than someone they were obligated to. The fact that in 3 weeks she had never once heard him speak unkindly to any of the men. She didn't say any of this. It wasn't the moment for it. She went back to the ledger, and he went back to the cattle records, and the lamp burned low between them. But she noticed it. She cataloged it, the way she cataloged everything that mattered, in the careful inventory she kept of the world around her. The operation hit its first real crisis at the end of the 4th week. She had seen it coming from about 3 days out, and had been trying to solve it before it arrived, which she mostly managed, though not without cost. The problem was flour. The Cheyenne rail order she'd placed as a backup after the Whitmore incident, she'd gone ahead and established the account, had been delayed by a derailment 200 miles east, which was the kind of disaster that cascaded through a supply chain in ways that were almost beautiful in their thoroughness. She had 1 week's worth of flour in the ranch kitchen. The Haskell deliveries required twice that. She could stretch the cornmeal, she could substitute in some of what she had, but bread was bread, and the men had specifically requested more of it, and she had told Haskell she could provide it. She drove to Harlow Creek on a Wednesday afternoon and went to every supplier she knew of. Whitmore, the small dry goods at the south end of town, even the feed store on the off chance someone was holding food-grade grain. She found enough flour to extend her supply by 4 days. Not enough, but closer. On the way home, passing the edge of Harlow Creek, she spotted a woman she didn't know hanging laundry in the yard of a small house at the town's north edge. The woman was perhaps 60, moving slowly, and the laundry was the laundry of someone who took in other people's washing. Adeline slowed the wagon. "Excuse me," she called. "Do you know where I might find additional flour in town? I've tried Whitmore and Hadley's." The woman looked at her with the frank appraisal of someone who'd lived long enough not to bother being indirect. "You the Cole bride?" "I am." A moment. Then, "Edith Crane has 50 pounds she's been trying to sell since her husband died. She's on the road past the church, 3rd house on the left. The white one." Adeline found Edith Crane. Edith Crane was a widow of 63 with 50 pounds of good milling flour and a price that was fair, and she sold it to Adeline over the kitchen table with the decisiveness of a woman who'd been waiting for someone to come and ask. "You need anything else?" Edith said, walking her out. "I need someone who can bake consistently in large quantities," Adeline said, which was something she hadn't consciously known she was going to say until she said it. Edith looked at her. "I've been baking for 40 years. Would you be interested in paid work? Early mornings. I'm running a delivery operation out to the railroad camp." Edith Crane considered this for exactly 4 seconds. "What are you paying?" Adeline told her. It was fair, on the edge of what she could currently manage, and she saw Edith calculate it the way a woman calculated any serious offer. Not just the number, but the whole shape of it. "Monday," Edith said. "I'll be at the ranch at 4:30. She was there at 4:15. She brought her own rolling pin. The operation absorbed Edith Crane the way a working kitchen absorbs a skilled pair of hands. Immediately, completely, with a relief that Adeline hadn't let herself feel until it arrived. Edith could produce biscuits and bread in quantities that transformed what they could offer. She also had opinions, which she expressed with the directness of someone who had reached the age at which there was no longer any point in being indirect, and most of her opinions were correct. "Your cornbread recipe is good, but you're using too much lard," she told Adeline on her second morning. "It keeps it from drying out in transport. Use a damp cloth over the top instead. Less lard, you get the crumb lighter, and it holds better if you wrap it right." Adeline tried it. Edith was right. She put this in the notebook under technique without ceremony because it didn't matter who was right, it mattered what worked. The flour crisis resolved. The supply chain steadied. The Cheyenne order came in, delayed by 10 days but intact, and she reorganized the pantry and the ordering schedule to buffer against the next disruption, which she knew with certainty would come, because supply chains were living things and living things failed at the worst possible moments. By the end of the 6th week, the Haskell operation was bringing in $91 per week. She knew this number precisely because she counted it twice, the way she counted everything that mattered twice. $91 a week, against a monthly operating deficit that had been $30 when she arrived. She sat with that number for a while. Not triumphantly, she'd learned the cost of that early. Triumph was something you could afford after you'd secured the thing, not while you were still building it. But she sat with it, and she let herself feel the weight of it, the specific gravity of a number that meant something real. She found Garrett by the corral that evening, leaning on the fence, watching the cattle. He'd been doing that more lately. Watching the cattle the way someone watches something they'd almost given up on. The cattle were visibly better, not ready for market, but on their way. She stood beside him at the fence. "I need to talk to you about the Cheyenne rail account," she said. "Okay. And the bank loan. I want to discuss a payment schedule." He turned to look at her. The evening light was coming sideways across the pasture, that particular western light that made everything look more significant than it probably was. He had dirt on his hands from the fence work he'd been doing earlier, and there were lines around his eyes that weren't just from squinting into the sun. "You're serious," he said. Not surprised exactly, more like a man still getting used to the radius of what she was capable of. "I'm always serious about numbers." He turned back to look at the cattle. Adeline. He said her name with a different quality than he'd started with. Not the careful formality of the early days, but something that had worn down to something more like just her name. "When you came here, that first day, what did you actually think?" She considered the question. She owed it a real answer. "I thought the land was good," she said. "I thought the cattle were thin, but there, I thought you were—" She paused. "I thought you were someone who'd been trying alone for too long." A long silence. A night bird called somewhere out in the dark grass. "Yeah," he said. "That's accurate." They stood there for another minute, not talking, while the last of the light went out of the sky. The cattle moved slow and dark shapes in the pasture. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, she could hear Otto's big laugh. He laughed at things easily, which was a gift, and the sound of it had become one of the familiar sounds of the ranch. Something she'd stopped noticing consciously, the way you stopped noticing the smell of a place you lived in. "I'll pull the loan documents tonight," Garrett said. "We can go through them after supper." "Good." She pushed off the fence. "Supper in 20 minutes. Sit eat." She went back to the kitchen. She had bread in the oven, Edith's modified recipe, her adaptation, and a pot of something on the stove, and the kitchen smelled the way a kitchen should smell when people were going to eat in it soon. She had a ledger entry to finish and an order to draft for Monday's supply run, and a note to write to Haskell about extending the contract terms before he had a chance to renegotiate from a position of knowing how well it was working. She was winning, carefully, incrementally, in the way that real things were won. Not in moments of glory, but in the accumulated weight of 100 small correct decisions made under pressure, one after another, until they added up to something that couldn't be undone. The bread smelled right. She checked it. Perfect crust, hollow knock when she tapped it. She set it on the rack to cool and went back to the ledger. $91 a week and climbing. She wrote it down, as she always did, and then she turned the page and started on the next problem. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, in Adeline's experience, the kind of day that delivered bad news most efficiently. Tuesdays had no drama to cushion things. They just handed you the problem and stood there. It came through the Harlow Creek Post, addressed to Mrs. A. Cole, Cole Ranch, in the kind of precise copperplate handwriting that announced institutional origin before you'd even broken the seal. She opened it at the kitchen table while Edith was shaping the morning's bread and Will was hauling water from the well, and she read it twice before she said anything. The letter was from the Northern Pacific Railway Land and Supply Division, offices in Cheyenne. It was signed by a man named Mr. Cornelius Voss, Director of Regional Operations. It was written in the smooth, confident language of a man who assumed his letters were received as gifts, and what it said, stripped of the courteous framing, was this. The railway was impressed by the food service operation she had established in partnership with camp foreman Haskell, and wished to formalize the arrangement under a company contract that would guarantee her a steady volume of business and streamlined supply access. The contract itself, 6 pages folded into the envelope, was enclosed for her review and signature. She read all 6 pages. Then she set the letter down and looked at the window for a moment. "Something wrong?" Edith asked, without turning from the bread. "Not yet," Adeline said. She picked the contract back up and read it again, more slowly this time, the way she read anything that mattered, not for the broad shape of it, but for the specific weight of individual words, the places where language became deliberately imprecise, the clauses tucked into subordinate positions where a person reading quickly might not register them. She found 4 of those clauses. Each one, on its own, sounded like a reasonable business provision. Together, they constituted a mechanism by which the Northern Pacific Railway would, within 18 months of signing, have effective control over her pricing, her supply relationships, and her ability to work with any other client in a 60-mile radius. She folded the contract neatly, put it back in its envelope, and placed it on the corner of the table where she kept things that required attention. That evening, she spread all 6 pages across the kitchen table and walked Garrett through them, clause by clause. He was not a man who read contracts frequently, but he was not a man who missed things when he paid attention, and he paid attention. She watched his expression move through careful reading to slow comprehension to the particular stillness that preceded his version of anger, which was not loud, but was thorough. "They'd own your client list," he said, when she reached the 4th problematic clause. "Effectively. And the pricing? You couldn't negotiate independently, not without their approval, which they could withhold, for any reason or no stated reason. See the language there, at the railway's reasonable discretion. Reasonable is doing a lot of work in that sentence." Garrett sat back in his chair. He looked at the contract the way he sometimes looked at the south pasture fence, like a problem that was going to require more energy than it was worth, but that he was going to deal with anyway because the alternative was worse. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to respond." She said it carefully. "Not refuse outright, not yet. Refusing outright loses the relationship, and the Haskell business is real income. But I'm not signing this, so you're negotiating." "I'm going to try." He was quiet for a moment. "You know who Voss is?" She looked up. "Should I?" "He's not just a regional director. His family's got significant railway holdings going back to before the war. He's used to getting what he wants out of contracts because most people in Wyoming are either too eager or too intimidated to read the fine print." "Well," Adeline said, "I'm neither." Garrett looked at her with that expression she'd catalogued, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but was what a smile looked like when it lived in a more contained face. "No," he said, "you're not." She spent 2 nights drafting her counterproposal. She wrote it, read it, crossed out half of it, wrote it again. She was not a lawyer. She was acutely aware of that. But she'd spent years watching how transactions worked, how agreements were structured, how people with power used language to embed advantage in documents, and she'd spent those years paying attention in the specific way of someone who knew they'd need that knowledge eventually. Her counterproposal did 4 things. It removed the exclusivity clause entirely. It restructured the pricing language to establish a floor below which the railway could not pressure her, with a defined escalation schedule that she controlled on her end. It limited the contract term to 6 months with mutual renewal option rather than the 2-year term Voss had proposed. And it added a provision she'd thought of at 2 a.m. on the second night, a quality guarantee on her end with measurable standards, which she included not because she doubted her own quality, but because having it in writing established that the arrangement was between equals, not between a company and a vendor. She copied it out clean in her best handwriting on a Wednesday morning, addressed the envelope to Cornelius Voss, Director of Regional Operations, and gave it to Charlie to take to the post on his supply run. Then she went back to work and didn't think about it any more than she could help, because thinking about things you couldn't currently act on was a waste of energy she needed elsewhere. The response took 9 days. She knew it would take at least a week, and she filled that week with the ranch's perpetual demands. The cattle operation was progressing. Garrett had negotiated a new buyer arrangement in Laramie, a contact of a contact who was paying 3 cents per pound more than Pruitt's rates, which she had calculated out over the projected August sale, and the number was meaningful. The kitchen garden was producing. Edith had taken on a second morning per week and had, at some point Adeline hadn't precisely tracked, become a fixture in the ranch kitchen in the way that useful, capable people became fixtures, quietly, through demonstrated value, until their absence would have been conspicuous. The sabotage started in the 8th week, and Adeline almost missed it because it came in a form she wasn't looking for. Charlie came back from the Tuesday supply run with a face that told her something was wrong before he'd stopped the wagon. He climbed down and handed her the supply receipts and said, "The flour order at Whitmore's." He wouldn't take the banknote. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "He said it was counterfeit." Charlie was uncomfortable delivering this, she could see. He was young enough that the word counterfeit carried dramatic weight. "He held it up to the light and showed me this mark on it, and he said the ink was wrong, and he couldn't take it." Adeline took the banknote from him. She turned it in the light. She looked at it carefully, the way she looked at anything she needed to understand. She had gotten that note from the payment Haskell had made last week. She was certain of it. She kept careful track of every bill that came into the operation and where it went, because she kept careful track of everything. She said calmly, "Take the wagon back. I'll go to Whitmore's myself." Whitmore showed her what he'd shown Charlie, the slight irregularity in the printing, the ink that was fractionally off in color. He was not unkind about it. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable, actually. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cole. I can't take it. Not my rule. There have been a few of these circulating, and the bank sent around a notice." "This note came directly from a payment by the Haskell camp," she said. "I believe you." He did seem to believe her. "But that doesn't change what it is." She went to the Harlow Creek Bank. She spoke to the manager, a careful man named Alderman, who had the look of someone whose job had recently become more complicated than he'd signed up for. He confirmed that there had been counterfeit notes circulating in the region. He wouldn't say how many, but his expression suggested the number was not small. He took her note for examination and gave her a receipt. He would let her know within the week whether it could be authenticated or would be written off. She walked back out into the Harlow Creek Main Street and stood for a moment in the midday sun. The note was almost certainly worthless, which meant last week's Haskell payment was short by $20, which was not catastrophic, but was a problem she hadn't planned for and didn't have a clean solution to. The deeper question was where the counterfeit note had entered the chain. Haskell paid her in cash, counted out in person. She had been there for every payment. Had Haskell himself been taken with counterfeit? Or had something else happened? She didn't have an answer to that yet. She filed the question in the part of her mind she kept for things that needed watching and went back to the ranch. She told Garrett that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was what she'd come to rely on. His ability to receive information without reacting to it before he'd actually processed it. "You think it's deliberate?" he said when she finished. "I think it might be. I don't know yet." "Who would benefit from disrupting your operation?" She'd been thinking about that on the ride home. "The camp has a cook arrangement that I've been supplementing. If my deliveries stop, that arrangement becomes more important again. Archie's not the type, and Haskell's not. He's getting value from me. But there's a supply contractor who was handling some of the food provisioning before I came in. A man named Slade, who Haskell mentioned in passing once. He lost the midday contract when I started the second delivery." Garrett turned his coffee cup slowly. "You think Slade put bad notes into the Haskell payment?" "I think it's worth considering. Someone who has access to the camp's cash flow and a reason to want me to have problems. That's a serious accusation to make without proof." "I know. I'm not making it yet. I'm just watching." She watched. She did it methodically, the way she did everything. Not with drama, not with confrontation, but by paying closer attention to the edges of transactions that were already happening. She started requesting payment in smaller denominations and counting everything at the point of exchange, which Haskell accepted without comment when she explained there'd been a counterfeiting issue in the region. She started noting in her notebook the names and faces of people who came and went at the camp supply area during her deliveries. She asked Charlie, casually, what he saw and heard on his supply runs, because Charlie was 17 and invisible in the way that young people on errands were invisible, and invisible people heard things. What Charlie heard on his third attentive supply run was a conversation between a man matching Slade's description and a bookkeeper at the camp who apparently owed Slade a considerable sum from a card game the previous winter. The conversation was about the timing of payments, and the vocabulary of it was suggestive in ways that weren't specific enough to prove anything, but were specific enough to be interesting. She was still building the case, careful, methodical, not rushing it, when Voss's response to her counterproposal arrived. The letter was longer than his first one. That alone told her something. Men who were confident they were going to get what they wanted wrote short letters. Men who were recalculating wrote long ones. He rejected 2 of her 4 changes outright. The exclusivity clause, he wrote, was standard railway practice and non-negotiable. The 2-year term was likewise a company requirement. However, and this was the word she'd been looking for, the hinge of it, he was open to discussing the pricing structure and would consider meeting with her to review the remaining terms in person. He suggested a meeting in Harlow Creek at the end of the month, at a time and location of her choosing, in person, which meant he thought the contract would be easier to close across a table, where he could apply the particular pressure that men of his standing applied in rooms, the weight of expectation, the implication that anyone of good sense would simply agree. She wrote back the same day. She accepted the meeting, named the date, named the location. She also, and she did this deliberately, having thought about it for 2 full days, named a witness. I will be accompanied by my husband, Garrett Cole, who is co-signatory to our business arrangements. She wanted Voss to understand before he walked into the room that this was not going to be a conversation with a woman alone. You want me at the meeting? Garrett said when she told him. I want you present. I'll be doing the talking. He looked at her steadily. I know that. I just need him to see that I'm not... She paused, searching for the right word. Isolated. Something crossed Garrett's face, not anger exactly, but something near it, a protective current that he didn't perform but that she could see running under the surface. I'll be there, he said simply. The week before the meeting, the sabotage escalated. It was Will who found it, early on a Thursday morning when he went to check the supply pantry before starting prep. He came to find Adeline with a look that was trying to be calm and not entirely succeeding. You should come see the flour, he said. 2 of the large sacks, the Cheyenne order, which had arrived fresh 4 days ago, had been opened from the bottom. Someone had mixed something into them, sand mostly. Enough to ruin both sacks without it being immediately obvious from the outside. About 60 pounds of flour. She stood in the pantry and looked at the ruined sacks and felt a cold, specific fury. Not the hot kind that made you say things, but the cold kind that made you think harder. Someone had been in this pantry. The pantry lock was simple, a standard latch, and she hadn't considered it a vulnerability because the ranch felt, to her, like a place where the threat was external. Supply chain problems, market prices, the bank. Not this. She was wrong to have not considered it. She counted what remained. She calculated what she could do with it. She had enough to make Friday's delivery if she supplemented with cornmeal and adjusted the bread portion down. The delivery would be short of what she'd promised. She was going to have to tell Haskell. She hated that part the most. Not the material loss. The material loss was bad, but material losses had solutions. What she hated was the position it put her in, having to explain to a man who'd trusted her operation that her operation had a vulnerability she hadn't protected against. She drove to the camp herself, without Charlie, and she told Haskell directly and clearly what had happened and what Friday's delivery would look like and why. Haskell listened. His expression moved through several things, none of them comfortable. When she finished, he said, You think it's Slade. The directness of it surprised her. You know about Slade. I know he's been angry since I cut his provisioning contract. I know he plays cards with a man who has access to the camp supply records. He rubbed his jaw. I don't have proof of anything. Neither do I. Yet. She looked at him. I'm working on it. What do you need from me? Documentation of every payment made to my operation for the last 8 weeks, with the bill denominations listed where possible. I want to trace the counterfeit note. He looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who'd worked in rough field operations his whole career, who dealt with labor disputes and supply failures and weather and equipment disaster, and she could see him recalibrating her in real time, adjusting whatever his prior estimation had been to accommodate what he was actually looking at. I'll have my bookkeeper pull it today, he said. Thank you. She picked up the reins. Friday's delivery will be what it is. The following week will be back to standard. I don't doubt it, he said. She got the documentation from Haskell's bookkeeper 2 days later, a young man named Foster, who was clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation and handed over the papers with the relief of someone transferring a problem. She went through them at the kitchen table that night, Garrett reading over her shoulder, and they found it within an hour. The counterfeit note traced to a payment cycle that went through Slade's old provisioning account, a residual payment from before the contract ended that had been processed through the camp's general cash pool. It wasn't conclusive. A good lawyer could argue it away, but it was a thread, and threads, pulled carefully, unraveled things. She brought the documentation to Alderman at the bank. She brought it to Haskell. She did not bring it to the sheriff, because the sheriff of Harlow Creek was a man she'd assessed in the first week as someone who handled things he understood and was confused by things he didn't. And a counterfeiting and sabotage situation with a railway contractor at the center of it was clearly in the second category. She let the railway's own internal authority handle it instead, because the railway had more power over Slade than the sheriff of a small Wyoming town ever would. What happened to Slade, exactly, she never fully knew. He was gone from the camp within 2 weeks of her presenting the documentation to Haskell. Haskell told her only that the matter had been resolved internally. She didn't push for details. She cared about the outcome, not the narrative of it. The meeting with Voss was on a Friday morning at the Harlow Creek Hotel, in the small room they used for commercial meetings. She'd arranged it through the hotel manager, a woman named Ruth Packard, who had looked at the arrangement with sharp, evaluating eyes and charged a fair rate without comment. Voss was not what she'd built up in her imagination. He was perhaps 55, compact, well-dressed without ostentation, with the manner of a man who'd conducted hundreds of negotiations and had a toolkit for all of them. He shook her hand with the slight hesitation of a man recalibrating for the firmness of the grip. He shook Garrett's hand the way he'd expected to shake it, man to man, familiar territory. Then they sat down. Adeline put her counterproposal on the table and her copy of his original contract beside it, and her notes. 3 pages of them. And she began. She did not begin with what she wanted. She began with what the arrangement was already worth to him, in numbers. She had calculated the productivity improvement at the Haskell camp based on Haskell's own production records, which Haskell had shared with her because she'd asked and he'd been willing. The productivity improvement was real and significant. She had the numbers, and she put them in front of Voss. She let him look at them. "This is your operation's value to the railway," she said. "Not in goodwill or quality of life, though those matter too, in dollars per day, per worker, per mile of track laid. The food service I'm providing is generating a return on investment for you, Mr. Voss, that your current contract terms don't reflect." He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. "These are your calculations. They're based on this camp's own production records, which Mr. Haskell will confirm. I can give you his contact information if you'd like to verify independently." He had not expected this. She could see him adjusting. "The exclusivity clause limits my ability to grow the operation, which limits your return. If I can serve other camps along this line, and there are 3 others within reasonable range, the quality and efficiency I've developed scales. The exclusivity clause caps that. It's not in your interest. It protects the railway's investment in the relationship. There's no railway investment in this relationship. I built the operation. I found the workers, developed the systems, solved the supply problems. The railway's investment is nothing. The protection it needs is quality assurance, which I've offered in writing." She tapped the relevant page of her counterproposal. "That clause is on page 4. A silence. Garrett, beside her, said nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the table, present and still, which was exactly what she'd asked of him and exactly what he was doing. She'd told him on the drive-in, "Don't agree, don't disagree, don't react, just be there." He was doing it with more ease than she'd expected, which was perhaps because Garrett Cole had always been better at stillness than at performance. Voss spent 5 minutes reviewing the counterproposal more carefully than he'd clearly expected to review it. She let him. She poured water from the pitcher on the table and drank it, and didn't fidget. "The term," he said finally. 2 years is standard for an established operation that exists before the contract. This operation I built from nothing in 8 weeks. The railway didn't take the risk of that. I did. 6 months, Mutual renewal gives us both the ability to assess whether the arrangement is working. If it is, we renew. If it isn't, we haven't locked either party into something that isn't serving them. He looked at her for a long moment. You've done this before. Negotiated? Thought like this? No, she said honestly. This is the first time I've done it at this scale. But I've been paying attention my whole life to how agreements work and who they work for, and I found that's worth more than experience in most cases. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and he made 2 marks on his copy of her counterproposal, and he turned it around to face her. He'd conceded the exclusivity clause and the term length. He'd held the pricing floor to a compromise, not her number, not his, but closer to hers than his. The quality guarantee stays as you've written it, he said. I respect the thinking. She looked at the marks. She looked at him. She didn't reach for the pen immediately because she had learned that the moment after someone makes a concession was not the moment to rush. I'll need 2 weeks to review with my husband before signing, she said. Voss blinked. He'd expected her to sign immediately. She could see it. Of course, he said after a beat. They shook hands. He left. Ruth Packard brought in coffee that nobody had ordered, set it down without comment, and went back out. Garrett looked at the marked-up counter-proposal and then at Adeline. 2 weeks? He said. You already know what you're going to do. Yes. So why 2 weeks? She poured the coffee. Because I want him to spend 2 weeks not knowing, and because I want to read it 4 more times before I put my name on it, and I want a second set of eyes on the language. I'm going to write to a solicitor in Cheyenne. He accepted this. He accepted the coffee. He looked at the document with the expression of a man who had watched something happen that he was still in the process of understanding. You held him to your terms, he said. A man like Voss, you held him. Most of them, she said. Not all. Most is considerable. She drank her coffee. Outside the small hotel window, Harlow Creek went about its Friday business. The street traffic, the voices, the ordinary workings of a town that had predicted her departure in July and was now, in the 7th week of her being there, adjusting that prediction. She could feel the adjustment in the way people spoke to her at Whitmore's, in the way Mrs. Fitch had nodded at her outside the dry goods store last week, with something that wasn't warmth exactly, but was no longer dismissal. The contract, when she signed it 3 weeks later, she'd taken the extra week because she'd meant what she said about reading it 4 more times, was not everything she'd wanted. It never was. Agreements between unequal parties were never entirely even, and she knew which party she currently was, even if the gap was narrower than Voss had planned for. But it was hers. Every clause she'd put in it was there because she'd put it there, argued for it, held the line on it. The exclusivity was gone. The term was 6 months. The pricing floor was defensible. The quality guarantee was mutual. She folded her copy and put it in the wooden box where she now kept the documents that mattered, alongside the ranch ledgers, the loan papers, the wage records, the notebook that was filling up with everything she'd learned since she stepped off a stagecoach in Wyoming with $40 and a worn leather bag. That evening, she made supper, a real supper, not an operational supper, not something calculated for efficiency. She made the beef stew she'd first brought to Haskell, the one that had started all of this, and she made proper bread, and she set the table in the ranch house dining room that had been used approximately never since she'd arrived. She called Garrett in from the yard and she put supper on the table, and they ate like 2 people who had come through something. Not at the end of it. She knew that. There was still the bank loan and the cattle sale and the fence repairs and the winter provisioning to plan and the Voss contract to execute and a dozen other things that would require her full attention starting tomorrow. But tonight there was stew and bread and lamplight, and a man across the table who had stopped looking at her like a solution to a problem and started looking at her like she was simply someone he was glad to know. She thought that might matter more than she'd expected it to when she arrived. She didn't say that. She passed the bread and asked about the cattle weights, and they talked about the ranch the way they always did, practically, directly, working through the numbers of the life they were building. But she noticed it. She always noticed the things that mattered. She just kept them in the part of her that was hers alone, until she knew what to do with them. The cattle sale happened on a Thursday in the 2nd week of August, and it went better than either of them had said out loud that they hoped it would. Garrett had driven 31 head to the Laramie buyer. The new contact, not Pruitt, never Pruitt again, and come back 2 days later with $412 in authenticated banknotes, which Adeline counted twice at the kitchen table while he stood in the doorway, still road dusty, watching her count. "It's real," he said. "I know, I'm counting anyway." She finished the second count, set the bills in a stack, looked at them for a moment. 412. Against the 1100 loan, but that's the biggest single payment we've been able to make. Combined with what the Voss contract has brought in this month. She was already reaching for the ledger. "We can make a payment of 540 to Alderman. That leaves the loan balance at 560, Garrett said. He'd done it in his head on the drive home, she realized. 2 days on the road, and he'd been doing arithmetic. She looked up at him. He looked back at her with the particular expression of a man who had been carrying a weight for so long that the sudden lightening of it didn't feel like relief yet. It felt like disorientation, like the muscle memory of bracing for something that was no longer there. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat. She made coffee. She put a plate of the oatmeal cookies she'd made that morning, Edith's recipe, which was better than hers and she'd admitted it, on the table between them, and they sat in the kitchen that smelled like a kitchen should smell, and went through the numbers the way they always went through the numbers, except that this time the numbers were going in the right direction and had been for long enough that it was starting to feel like a trend rather than a fluke. After an hour of ledger work, Garrett pushed back from the table and rubbed his face with both hands. The gesture of a man surfacing from deep water. "The south pasture fence," he said. "What about it?" "It's been—" He stopped. "I've been putting it off for 2 years because there was no money for materials. If we set aside 40 from this month's operation, we can do the worst section before winter." "I was thinking 50, she said. "And I want to talk to you about the bunkhouse roof. Otto says there's a soft spot on the east side." "I know about the soft spot. It'll be a hard spot by November if we don't deal with it." He was quiet for a moment. 40 for the fence, 30 for the bunkhouse roof. That still leaves enough. She said it with confidence because she'd run the projections 3 separate times from 3 different angles, and they all came out to the same answer. "We're going to be all right, Garrett." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she'd been seeing more of lately. Something that lived underneath the pragmatic exterior he'd worn for years. Something that the exterior had been protecting. "I'm starting to believe that," he said. "That's new." She didn't make a thing of it. She just picked up her coffee and went back to the ledger. But she heard it, and she kept it, the way she kept all the things that mattered. The change between them had been happening for weeks in small increments, the way most real changes happened. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments, each one ordinary enough on its own, the combined weight of them becoming something else entirely without either of them declaring it. It was in the way he'd started leaving coffee on the stove for her in the mornings before she got to the kitchen, which she'd noticed the first time with surprise and said nothing about, and which had continued. It was in the way she'd started making 2 plates instead of 1 when she ate late. One for her, one in case he came in from whatever night work he was doing and hadn't eaten. It was in the way conversations that started as logistics, the cattle, the contract, the fence line, would drift, without either of them seeming to intend it, into other territory. She was patching the kitchen curtains one evening in September. They'd lasted long enough, she'd decided, when he came in from checking on a heifer who'd been off her feed, and instead of going directly to wash up and then to bed, which was his usual pattern, he pulled a chair and sat at the other end of the table and said, without particular preamble, "Tell me about your family." She looked up from the curtain. "Why?" "I don't know much about where you came from. We talk about the ranch." "We talk about the ranch because the ranch is what requires talking about." "I know, but I'm asking." He wasn't demanding it, wasn't pushing, just asking, the way he asked for things when he actually wanted them, directly, without decoration. She looked at the curtain. She put a few more stitches in it before she answered. "My father died when I was 9. My mother lasted until I was 14, and then she was gone too. Fever that winter, bad one. I went to work for the Whitmore family in Cincinnati after that. They were—" She paused, measuring the word. "Not unkind, just not family. I was help. That's different." "No one else? No relatives?" "A cousin on my mother's side who I wrote to once and who didn't write back. I stopped expecting things from people who'd already told me what they thought of me. He was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of years alone. I had the cook at the Whitmore house, Mrs. Delaney. She's the reason I know what I know in a kitchen. She was good at it the way some people are good at things, like it came from somewhere deeper than learning. She died my 3rd year there, and after that She made a small gesture with the curtain. Managed. How old were you? 19. He turned his coffee cup on the table. I was 23 when my father died. I already had the ranch by then. He'd been stepping back, I'd been stepping up. But it still... He stopped, reconsidered. It still took the floor out. Yes, she said. That's the right word for it. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the September dark was thick, and the first real cold of the season was starting to come in at the edges. You could feel it around the window frames in the evenings now, the reminder that Wyoming winter was not a metaphor. Clara, he said. He said the name with the carefulness he always used for it, not with pain that was raw, but with the care of something that had healed imperfectly and you moved around without leaning on. She came out here because she loved the idea of it, the frontier, the open land. She was a romantic in the good way. She believed in things thoroughly. A pause. The reality of it was harder than the idea. I knew that, she knew it, but I don't think I helped enough. I kept thinking if I just kept the ranch together, kept the work going, that was the thing she needed. I wasn't... He stopped again. Adeline put the curtain down. She looked at him. I wasn't present, he said. The last year especially. I was managing the debt, managing the herd, managing everything except paying attention to her. And then she got sick in March, and she was gone by June, and there were things I hadn't said. He exhaled slowly. I've been sitting with that for 3 years. The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp between them made the same small sounds it always made, the tiny adjustments of flame. You didn't cause her illness, Adeline said. I know that, but you feel like you wasted time. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. For what it's worth, she said carefully, I think the man who kept those wage records, the ones in the wooden box, is not a man who stopped caring about the people depending on him. I think you were trying to hold everything together the only way you knew how. That's not the same as not being present. It's just the wrong tool for what was needed. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought maybe she'd overstepped, said too much, presumed a kind of understanding she hadn't been offered. Then he said, the wrong tool, yeah. And something in his face settled, not resolved, not finished, but the specific settling of a thing that has been held in one position too long being allowed to shift. How do you do that? Do what? Say the thing that's actually... He made a gesture that meant right, accurate, the center of it. Without making it feel like judgment. She picked the curtain back up. I had a lot of years watching how things worked from the outside. You see patterns when you're outside them that you can't see when you're in the middle. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stood up and he said goodnight in the usual way, and he went to bed. But the quality of the goodnight was different, less like the closing of a transaction, more like, she didn't have a precise word for it, more like someone leaving a room they intended to come back to. She sat alone in the kitchen for a while after, with the curtain in her hands and the lamp burning and the sound of the ranch at night around her, and she thought about tools and what they were wrong for. The harvest work began in October, and with it a new crisis, which was simply the nature of the thing. She'd accepted that by now. There was always a new crisis. The question was just which one and how bad. This one was Pete Dolan. He came to her on a Monday morning while she was doing the supply calculations for the week, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands in the posture of a man about to say something he'd been putting off. My brother's in Casper, he said. He's been ranching out there on his own, and he's not well, his wife wrote me. They've got 3 kids, and she doesn't know how to run the operation, and he can't get out of bed. Adeline put down her pencil. How bad is it? Bad enough that she wrote. He turned his hat in his hands. I need to go, Mrs. Cole. I don't want to... I know the timing. Pete. She said it clearly enough that he stopped turning the hat. Of course you go. Today, if you can. He looked at her with an expression that was gratitude mixed with something else. The slight surprised quality of a person who expected to have to argue for a reasonable thing and hadn't needed to. I don't know how long, however long it takes. Your job is here when you come back. Mr. Cole, I'll talk to Garrett. Go pack. She told Garrett at midday. He listened, nodded, said of course, in the same tone she had, which was the tone of people who had once had nothing and therefore understood what it was to need something from another person. We'll manage, Garrett said. Dennis can take some of Pete's responsibilities. Samuel knows the herd as well as anyone. I'll talk to them. I'll give Pete 2 weeks of wages in advance before he goes, she said. We can… Yes. He didn't hesitate. Do that. Pete Dolan left the next morning with money in his pocket and the particular expression of a man who had been loyal to something for a long time and had discovered at the moment he needed it that the loyalty was returned. The ranch operated without Pete for 6 weeks. It was harder without him. Pete had been the connective tissue of the operation, the institutional knowledge, the man who remembered where things were and why things worked the way they did. But Dennis Hatch turned out to have more capability than he'd been given scope for, and Samuel was steady in a way that held the center of things when everything else was under pressure. And Garrett worked himself flat out in ways that reminded her of the early weeks, but with a different quality to it. Not the desperate maintenance of a dying operation, but the hard work of someone building towards something. She noticed the difference. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. One evening, in mid-October, she was in the barn after supper. She'd gotten into the habit of going there sometimes in the evenings when she needed to think, because the horses and the smell of hay and the barn sounds were grounding in a way she couldn't quite explain. She was sitting on a hay bale with her notebook, working through the Voss contract renewal figures. The 6-month term was coming up, which meant renegotiation, which meant preparation, when she heard Garrett come in. He didn't seem surprised to find her there. He'd stopped being surprised by where she was and what she was doing. He checked the heifer in the 3rd stall. She'd been slow this week, and then leaned on the stall door and looked at Adeline across the barn. Voss numbers? He asked. Renewals in 3 weeks. How does it look? Better than last time. We have 5 months of delivery data now. The productivity numbers from the camp are… Garrett, they're significant. He's going to try to expand the contract, and he's going to try to use that as leverage to put the exclusivity back in. And you're going to not let him. She flipped a page in the notebook. But I need to be ready for what he offers as a trade for dropping it. He was quiet for a moment. The heifer shifted in her stall. You know what you're doing, he said. It wasn't a question. I know more than I did in June. She paused. I don't always know what I'm doing. I know what direction I'm going. That's different. He came and sat on a hay bale a few feet from hers, not crowding her, just settling into the same space. The barn was warm despite the October cold outside. Can I ask you something? You usually just ask. Fair. He looked at his hands for a moment. Did you think, when you signed up with the agency, did you think there was any chance that the arrangement would be… He seemed to be searching for the right word and not finding it. What it's become. She thought about that honestly. No, she said. I thought it would be a practical arrangement. 2 people managing a difficult situation together. I thought if it worked, it would work the way a business works. Mutual benefit. And now? She looked at her notebook. Now I think I underestimated what happens when 2 people go through something genuinely hard together. What it does to… She paused. What it makes. He was very still. Yeah, he said quietly. Me too. Neither of them said anything after that for a while. The barn made its small nighttime sounds. The heifer breathed slow and steady in her stall. I wasn't going to survive another year of this alone, Garrett said. He said it with the plainness of a fact he'd arrived at the far side of. Not the ranch. The ranch I could have kept going one way or another, probably. But the… He stopped. I'd stopped believing it was for anything. The work. You just do it because you can't stop doing it, but you stop thinking it's leading somewhere. Adeline looked at him. And now? He looked back at her with the direct, unguarded quality he'd only recently started allowing. Now, I wake up in the morning, and the first thing I think about isn't what's going to go wrong. It's… A pause, a slight roughness in his voice that he didn't try to smooth out. Usually it's whatever you said last night that I'm still thinking about. She felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise. She'd felt the direction of things for weeks. She'd cataloged the evidence of it the way she cataloged everything. But feeling the direction of something and having it said plainly in a barn in October were different in a way that she hadn't anticipated. "Garrett," she said, "I know we didn't start this." He made a gesture at the space between them, meaning everything. "The normal way. I know what I offered you through that agency was not—" He stopped, tried again. "I know I wasn't in a condition to offer someone much of anything in March. The letter I sent the agency was probably the most honest thing I'd written in 3 years. I need help. The ranch is failing. I don't have a lot to give." "I remember what you sent," she said. "The agency showed me the letter before I signed." "And you came anyway." "I came because the letter was honest. Most of them weren't." She paused. "I'd been reading the agency profiles for 2 months. Most of the men wrote what they thought women wanted to read. You wrote what was true." He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't think anyone would take it." "I nearly didn't." "What changed your mind?" She thought about that. The real answer, not the diplomatic one. There was a line in the letter, after all the practical things, the debt, the ranch, the situation. You wrote, "The land is good. I believe that. I just need someone else to believe it with me." She looked at him. That didn't sound like a man who'd given up. That sounded like a man who was still in it. Something in his face broke open, quietly. Not dramatically. No grand gesture, no overwhelming display. Just the particular opening of a face that has been holding itself together for a long time. The expression of a person who has been seen accurately and is still adjusting to how that feels. "I didn't know if I still believed it," he said. "When I wrote it." "But you wrote it." "Yeah." His voice was rough now, and he wasn't trying to fix it. "I wrote it." She set the notebook down on the hay bale. She looked at him across the warm, dim barn. This man with his road-worn hands and his careful silences and his meticulous wage records and his grief that he'd been carrying like furniture in a room he'd stopped going into. "The land is good," she said. "I believe that." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not tentatively, not with the uncertainty of someone unsure of the reception, with the directness of a man who had assessed the situation and decided. His hand was calloused and large and warm, and she felt the weight of it against hers and thought, there it is. There's what this has been becoming. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand and held his back. They sat like that for a while, in the October barn, with the heifer breathing steadily in her stall and the wind coming up cold outside, and the lamp throwing its small circle of warmth over the hay smell and the quiet. "I don't know how to do this right," he said. "Whatever this is turning into, I haven't—" He paused. "I'm not—" "I know," she said. "Me neither." "That's supposed to be reassuring?" "It is to me. I don't want someone who already knows everything. I've been managing around people who thought they knew everything my entire life. I want someone who's willing to figure it out." He exhaled. His thumb moved across the back of her hand. A small, specific gesture that was not practiced or performed. Just something his hand did because it was there and she was there. "I think I can do that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "I've been watching you for 4 months." He almost smiled. The barn almost smiled. The one she'd been cataloging since June was getting closer to actual. "Is that what you've been doing? Watching?" "Watching, counting, taking notes. I take notes on everything." "I've noticed the notes." "Most people miss the notes." "I noticed them the first week. I noticed pretty much everything about you from the first week." He said this matter-of-factly, the way he said most true things, without drama, just stated. "You rearranged the pantry on the second day. I didn't say anything. You didn't need to. The arrangement made more sense." "It did." A pause. "You also fixed the latch on the bunkhouse door that's been loose since spring. Nobody asked you to." "It was annoying me. Most things that need doing annoyed you until you did them." He looked at their joined hands. "I've been watching too, for what it's worth." It was worth quite a lot, she thought. But she didn't say that immediately. She let it sit in the barn with the warmth and the hay smell and the steadiness of his hand in hers, and she thought about all the things she'd believed coming out here, about what this arrangement would be and what it wouldn't be, and how thoroughly, quietly, and completely she'd been wrong about most of it. Not in the bad way. In the other way. Pete Dolan came back in November, thinner and tired, with the look of a man who had been through something and had come out the other side still standing. He'd gotten his brother stabilized. The illness had been serious but was manageable with rest and proper care, and he'd organized the Casper operation enough that his sister-in-law could run it through the winter. He arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon and found Adeline in the kitchen and Garrett coming in from the barn and the ranch functioning without him in ways that clearly surprised him. The bunkhouse roof repaired, the south pasture fence done, the kitchen garden put to bed properly for winter. He stood in the yard and turned slowly, looking at everything, and then he looked at Adeline. "You kept it together," he said. "We all did," she said. "Come inside. There's supper." That was the thing she'd started to understand, somewhere in the middle of all of it. The deliveries and the contracts and the sabotage and the ledgers and the long evenings at the kitchen table. It was never one person keeping anything together. It was the specific accumulation of people who showed up. Pete coming back, Dennis stepping up, Samuel steady in the middle, Will growing into more than he'd arrived as, Edith in the kitchen every morning with her rolling pin and her opinions, Charlie on the wagon who had learned over months to anticipate problems before they became crises. And Garrett, who had started the whole thing with a letter so honest it had crossed 100 miles of frontier and found the one woman in Cincinnati who would read it right. The evening Pete came back, they all ate together in the ranch house dining room. All of them. The full table that she'd started setting twice a month when the operation's income allowed for something worth celebrating. Pete and Dennis and Will and Samuel and Otto and Charlie and Edith, who had technically stopped being a ranch employee months ago and had become something else. Something closer to the category of people you couldn't imagine not being there. Otto made a toast with the hard cider she'd learned to make from the apple tree at the back of the property that everyone had apparently forgotten existed until she found it in September. He raised his cup and said, with the enthusiastic earnestness of a man who felt things thoroughly, "To the woman who fed us when we were hungry and paid us when we were owed and did not even once, run away when she should have." "She never should have run away," Will said, which was the most direct thing she'd heard him say in 5 months. "I wasn't going to," Adeline said. "We know that now," Pete said. He said it with the particular authority of the senior man, the one who'd seen the most, who'd been there the longest, who had watched the whole arc of it from the first day when he'd driven a stagecoach-rattled woman in from Harlow Creek in the mud. "We didn't know it in June. Some of us—" He glanced at the men with the mild expression of someone narrating history accurately. "Some of us had our doubts." "All of us had doubts," Otto said cheerfully. "Not me," said Will. "You were terrified," Dennis said. Will turned red. "I was optimistic." Adeline laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one, the kind that came up without asking permission. She heard Garrett laugh too, from beside her, and that sound, his actual laugh, not the almost laugh she'd been cataloging, but the real one, was new enough to stop her for half a second. She looked at him. He was still laughing, talking to Pete about something, his face open in a way she hadn't seen it be open before. He looked like a man who had come back from somewhere. She picked up her cider and turned back to the table and let herself, carefully, fully, be in the room. Outside, Wyoming was doing what Wyoming did in November. Wind off the mountains, cold that had weight to it, the long dark that would settle in until spring. The cattle were in good condition for the first time in years. The loan balance was below $600. The Voss contract renewal was in her notebook with her proposed terms already written, her arguments already sequenced. There was still so much to do. There always would be. That was the nature of the thing she'd chosen, and the place she'd come to, and the life that had turned out, against most reasonable probability, to be hers. She was glad of it. That was the simple truth she'd arrived at, somewhere between the ledgers and the barn and the October hay bale and all the small accumulations of a life being built from scratch in the right company. She was genuinely, practically, fully glad. The letter from Cheyenne arrived on a Wednesday in late February, which was, unlike Tuesdays, a day Adeline had no particular superstition about. She was in the kitchen reviewing the spring supply orders when Charlie brought it in from the post run, still cold from the ride, and set it on the table with the careful manner he developed for things that looked important. It was from the office of a solicitor named Harlan Beckett. The language was formal and dense in the way of legal documents, but she read through it quickly because she'd gotten good at finding the center of things. And the center of this was, a woman named Margaret Foss had died in January in Cheyenne. And in her will, she had left the entirety of her catering enterprise, the Foss Provisions Company, its contracts, equipment, accounts, and goodwill, to Adeline Cole, née Mercer, of Harlow Creek, Wyoming. Adeline read it twice. Then she sat down, which was not something she did in the middle of the morning. Margaret Foss. She hadn't heard that name in 6 years. Margaret had been the owner of the boarding house in Cincinnati, where Adeline had lived for 3 years. A stout, practical woman in her 60s who had run her establishment with the efficiency of someone who'd learned early that sentiment without structure was just sentiment. She'd watched Adeline cook for the boarding house residents during the winter when the regular cook was sick, watched her manage the kitchen and the accounts simultaneously, and had said once, in the direct way she had, "You've got the mind for this, girl. Don't waste it on someone else's kitchen your whole life." Adeline had not known Margaret well. She had not known Margaret had built a catering company. She had absolutely not known she was in Margaret's will. She was still sitting at the table when Garrett came in for his mid-morning coffee, read her face, and stopped in the doorway. What happened? She handed him the letter. He read it standing up, and she watched him read it. The slight change in his expression as he reached the center of it, the careful stillness that meant he was processing something large. He set the letter down. A catering company. In Cheyenne. She had contracts with 3 hotels, 2 railway dining operations, and a government provisioning account. That's... He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. That's not a small thing. No. He looked at her carefully. How do you feel about it? It was the right question. Not what are you going to do or what does this mean for us, but how did she feel? She registered that he'd learned to ask the right questions and filed it in the part of her that kept track of such things. Confused, she said honestly. I didn't know she thought about me at all. After I left Cincinnati, I never wrote. I didn't think there was anyone there worth writing to. She apparently thought differently. Apparently. She looked at the letter. She built that company from nothing. Her husband died young, she mentioned it once early on when I lived there. She said the boarding house was what she had left after the debts were settled, and she'd made it into something. A pause. I didn't know she kept going after the boarding house. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Sounds familiar. She looked up at him. He wasn't being clever about it. He meant it plainly. She felt the parallel land in her chest with a weight that was partly grief for a woman she hadn't known well enough, and partly something else. Something that had to do with the specific loneliness of people who built things alone and were seen for it only after they were gone. I need to go to Cheyenne, she said. I know. The ranch? We'll be here. It'll be fine. He said it with the confidence of a man who'd watched his operation stabilize over months into something that no longer required him to hold it together through sheer will. Pete's back. Dennis knows what he's doing. You can go. She went the following week, taking the train from Harlow Creek to Cheyenne. 2 hours of Wyoming winter landscape passing outside the window. The flat white of the high plains, the occasional dark line of a fence, the sky that went on past the point of comfortable. She spent the time in the Beckett solicitor's office, going through the Fossey Provisions Company records with the same methodical attention she'd brought to Garrett's ledger box 9 months ago, looking for the bones of the thing beneath the surface of it. The bones were good. Margaret Foss had run a tight operation, better organized than Adeline's current setup, which was still partly improvised from the urgency of its beginnings. The client relationships were strong. The equipment was real and paid for. The accounts receivable were clean. The one liability was a supply contract that was overpriced and coming up for renewal, which Adeline spotted immediately and marked in her notebook for renegotiation. Harlan Beckett, the solicitor, a dry, precise man who had apparently known Margaret well and approved of her decisions without necessarily explaining why, watched Adeline go through the records and said, on the second afternoon, Mrs. Fossey spoke of you occasionally. Adeline looked up. What did she say? That you were the only girl who ever worked in her boarding house who treated the kitchen like it was worth something. He paused. And that you would figure out what to do with whatever life handed you. She was, I think, correct. Adeline looked back at the records. She didn't trust herself to say anything immediately, so she didn't say anything, which was a skill she'd practiced long enough that it served her when she needed it. She came back to Harlow Creek on a Friday with the inheritance papers signed and a plan that she'd worked out on the train in both directions, filling 6 pages of her notebook with projections and questions and the specific kind of thinking that happened best in motion. Garrett was waiting at the station. Not with Pete and the wagon, as she'd expected. Himself, with Dutch and the buggy he'd repaired over the winter as a project she'd thought was purely mechanical until this moment. She climbed down from the train and he was there, hat in his hands and coat against the February cold, and he looked at her with the direct, unguarded expression that she'd watched him grow into over 9 months and said, "How was Cheyenne?" "Informative." She took his arm because the platform was icy. "I'll tell you everything. Let's go home." Home. She'd said it without thinking. She noticed that she'd said it without thinking, which was, she decided, exactly the right way for that word to arrive. On the drive back, she told him the shape of it, the company, the contracts, the supply issue, what she thought could be done with it. He listened, asked 3 questions, all of them the right ones. By the time they reached the ranch gates, she had the outline of the plan clear. "I want to keep both," she said, "the delivery operation here and the Cheyenne company. They're not competing, they're complementary. The Cheyenne contracts are larger and more established. The operation here has supply relationships and the Voss contract and Edith and the local reputation. Together you have a real company," Garrett said. "We have a real company," she said. "I'm not doing this without your name on it." He looked at her sidelong from the driver's seat. "It's your inheritance. It's our ranch that made it possible to be someone Margaret Fossey thought worth leaving something to." She said it plainly, because it was plain. "I would have signed up with that agency and gone somewhere else, and it might have been fine, or it might not. It was this place. It was you. I'm not pretending otherwise." He was quiet for a moment. Dutch plodded along the road with his usual opinionated pace. The ranch came into view around the bend. The house with its repaired porch, the barn with its weather vane restored to full rotation, the bunkhouse with its solid roof, the pastures beginning the slow February process of deciding to become spring. "All right," Garrett said, our company." She nodded once and looked at the ranch and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has said the accurate thing and had it received accurately. The next 6 months were the hardest work of her life, which was a significant statement given the competition. Running 2 operations across 150 miles required systems that she'd never built before. And building systems while running operations was like repairing a wagon while it was moving. Possible, but not comfortable, and not without moments where something came loose at speed. She hired a manager for the Cheyenne operation, a woman named Frances Dodd, who had worked for Margaret Foss for 4 years and knew the company's rhythms better than any outside hire could. Frances was 38, widowed, capable, and had been quietly hoping someone would put her in charge of something since Margaret's health started declining. Adeline gave her the operational authority and a profit share that she calculated was fair and that Frances accepted with the brisk gratitude of someone who knew what it was worth. She renegotiated the overpriced supply contract within 3 weeks. The supplier hadn't expected to be renegotiated with. He'd apparently counted on the disruption of inheritance to carry the existing terms through another cycle. And his surprise lasted about 15 minutes before he agreed to Adeline's revised terms, because the alternative was losing the account entirely, and he knew it. She formalized the Harlow Creek operation into a named entity, Coal Provisions. She filed the paperwork herself, rode to the county seat on a cold March morning, and came back with the documentation that made it official. That evening, she showed Garrett the papers, and he looked at his name on them, Coal Provisions, proprietors Garrett and Adeline Cole, with an expression that she'd stopped trying to fully interpret and started simply keeping. "That's real," he said. "It is. My father—" He stopped, tried again. "My father would have—" He stopped again, and she didn't push because she knew what he was trying to say, and she knew he'd get there, or he wouldn't, and either was all right. "He would have liked you," Garrett said finally. "He would have liked you considerably." She put the papers in the wooden box. The wooden box that had once held only debt records and loss now held contracts and licenses and a future that was, for the first time, larger than the problems it had to solve. Edith Crane, somewhere in the middle of spring, mentioned to Adeline that she knew 2 women in Harlow Creek who were good cooks and needed work. A widow named Helen, whose husband had left her with 5 children and a quarter-acre lot, and a younger woman named Rose, who had come from further east looking for something she hadn't found yet. Adeline hired them both. She paid them fairly, which in Harlow Creek in 1885 was not universal, and she trained them systematically, which meant she taught them what she knew in the way that Mrs. Delaney had once taught her, not withholding the knowledge, not protecting her own position with it, but passing it on whole. Helen cried on her first payday. Not dramatically. She turned away and composed herself and came back with her face straight and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Cole." Adeline said, "You earned it, same as always." But she understood what the money meant to someone with 5 children and a quarter-acre lot, because she understood the specific mathematics of being a woman without a safety net, and she never forgot it. The dining hall was Garrett's idea, which surprised her. He brought it up on an evening in June, almost exactly a year after she'd arrived, when they were sitting on the repaired front porch in the kind of June evening that made the case for Wyoming more convincingly than any pamphlet. "There's a building on the north end of Harlow Creek that's been empty since the hardware man left in the fall," he said. "Decent size, solid walls." She looked at him. And Edith mentioned that Helen mentioned that there are families in town eating badly because they can't afford to cook properly. The ones where both people are working, or the ones where something's happened. He paused. "We could put something in that space. Not charity. A working dining hall. Affordable prices. Good food." She turned that over. The numbers assembled themselves in her head without being asked. It would need subsidy from the operation to keep prices where people could actually use it. "I know. I've been thinking about that. How much are you willing to put in?" He named a number. It was real money. Ranch money. Money they'd worked for. And the fact that he'd arrived at it before the conversation told her he'd been thinking about it longer than this evening. She looked at the pastures in the June light. The cattle were good this year, genuinely good, the herd healthy, and the weight where it needed to be for the August sale. The loan to Alderman's Bank had been paid off in April, the final payment made on a Tuesday morning with Garrett standing beside her at the counter in a silence that was not empty but full. Alderman had shaken both their hands and said, with the genuine warmth of a man who'd doubted and been proven wrong, "I'm glad to have been wrong about this ranch." "So am I," Adeline had said. The dining hall opened in August, in the building on the north end of Harlow Creek that Garrett had identified, with Helen running the front of the house and Rose in the kitchen, and a menu that was simple and filling and priced at rates that a working family could manage. It was not a grand opening. There was no ceremony. Adeline unlocked the door on a Monday morning, and people came in because they were hungry, and the smell was good, and the price was on the board where anyone could read it. By the end of the first week, it was feeding 40 people a day. By the end of the month, 60. Mrs. Fitch came in on a Thursday in September and sat at a table and ate a bowl of beef stew and cornbread and did not say anything to Adeline about it, but she left a tip that was more than was necessary, and she came back the following week and the week after that. People did not transform dramatically. Towns did not change overnight. Adeline had no illusions about that. She'd lived long enough to know that the world moved in small corrections, not sudden revelations. But small corrections, accumulated, added up to something real. She could see it in the way Harlow Creek talked about the coal operation now. Not with the skeptical countdown of how long until she quits, but with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of something that was simply part of the landscape now. Will Cutler, in October, told her he'd been offered a position managing a small ranch operation north of town. He came to her with the offer letter in his hand and the expression of a person asking for something without knowing how to ask. "Should I take it?" he said. She thought about it seriously because he deserved a serious answer. "Do you want to manage something of your own?" "I think so, yes." "Then yes." She handed the letter back. "You're ready. You've been ready for a while." He looked at her with the expression he'd had that first morning over the biscuits. The young man who wanted to be useful and hadn't been given enough chances yet. Except the expression was different now because he'd had the chances and he'd used them. "I wouldn't have known how to run an operation if I hadn't watched you run one," he said. "You would have figured it out eventually." "Maybe." He folded the letter. but it would have taken longer. He left at the end of October with a week's extra pay and a letter of reference she wrote in her clearest handwriting, which she meant every word of. Otto, when he heard about Will's departure, made a speech at supper that went on considerably longer than necessary and involved several anecdotes that Adeline was fairly certain were embellished. Dennis Hatch told him to sit down. Pete Dolan laughed in the quiet way he laughed at things. Samuel, who had gotten a letter from his mother in Texas that week that had made him sit alone on the fence for an hour before supper, raised his cup and said nothing, and the silence said more than Otto's speech. The ranch carried on. That was the truth of it, unglamorous and real. It carried on one day and one problem and one solved problem at a time. And the carrying on was itself the thing. In December, a year and 7 months after she'd arrived on a mud-rutted stage into Harlow Creek, Adeline sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening with the year's final accounts in front of her. The ranch was profitable. Coal provisions had cleared enough to fund the dining hall's subsidy and still show a real margin. The Fosse Company in Cheyenne, under Francis Dodd, had renewed 2 of its 3 hotel contracts and picked up a 4th. The bank loan was gone. The men were paid in full, on time, every month. She added the final column. She checked it. She closed the ledger. Garrett came in from the cold. He'd been checking on the heifer that was close to calving and stopped when he saw her expression. "Good?" he said. "Good," she said. He poured himself coffee and came and sat across from her, and she turned the ledger around so he could see the final number. He looked at it for a moment. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling in the way of a man who is trying to hold something properly in his mind without losing the edges of it. "That's what 1 year looks like," he said. "Year and a half." 1 year and a half. He looked at her. "You know what 2 looks like?" "Bigger," she said. "If we're smart about it." He smiled. "The real one, not the almost one." She'd stopped cataloging the difference months ago because the real one was simply the one he had now. We're usually smart about it. Usually. Not always. No, not always. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to tell you something." She waited. Outside, the December dark was total, the kind of darkness that a town further east wouldn't know. No ambient light, no nearby neighbor's lamp, just the ranch and the stars and the cold. She had learned to find that darkness comfortable. She hadn't expected to. "When I wrote that letter to the agency," he said, "I wrote it at about 2 a.m. because I couldn't sleep, and I'd been sitting at this table for an hour trying to figure out one more way to make the numbers work. And I couldn't, and I thought," he paused, "I thought, if I ask for help and someone comes and it doesn't work, I'll be exactly where I am. And if I don't ask, I'll definitely be exactly where I am." He turned his coffee cup. "So I asked." She looked at him. "I know. You told me." "I didn't tell you all of it." He met her eyes. "When I wrote I believe this land is good, I just need someone to believe it with me. I didn't believe it. Not all the way. I was writing what I wished I believed, because I thought if I put it in writing, maybe I could get back to believing it again." The kitchen was very quiet. "And now?" she said. He looked at her with the full, uncomplicated directness of a man who had stopped protecting himself from his own answers. "Now I believe it because it turned out to be true." He paused. "And because you came." She could have said something. There were things worth saying. But she had also learned over a year and a half that Garrett Cole didn't need her to fill every silence. That he was a man who meant things and didn't need them confirmed back to him in the same moment. That she could simply let a true thing be true in the room between them without decoration. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand and held hers back. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen of the ranch that was alive again, in the middle of the winter that would end in spring, in the life that had been built from debt and doubt and cold beans and a skillet and 6,000 miles of determination and a letter written at 2 a.m. by a man who was trying to believe something hard enough to make it real. It had become real. Not perfectly. Never perfectly, because real things weren't. The fence would need work again by spring. Francis would call with a contract problem in January that would require 2 trips to Cheyenne to sort. Helen's daughter would get sick in February, and Adeline would sit with her in the dining hall kitchen for 3 hours waiting for the fever to break, because that was what you did when someone who worked for you had a sick child. There would be a dry summer in 2 years that would test the cattle operation harder than any summer since Garrett's father's time. But the land was good. She had known it from the buckboard on the first day, looking at what everyone else had looked at and seen differently. Not what was broken, but what was underneath the broken, what would still be there after you dealt with the broken. The bones of it. The dark soil, the water that would run again, the grass that would come back with the right management and the right rain and the right belief. She had believed it. She had made someone else believe it again. That turned out to be more than enough to build a life on. The lamp burned between them in the December kitchen. The accounts were settled, the year was ending, the ranch was quiet and whole and theirs. Outside, somewhere in the winter pasture, a calf was being born into the Wyoming cold. The heifer Garrett had been watching, her time come at last. He would need to go back out in an hour. She would probably go with him, because that was what she did. She went where the work was, and the work was always somewhere. But for now, they sat. And the lamp burned. And the night held the ranch in its dark, ordinary hands, and it was enough. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.